it's very clear the ceasefire came into being because there was a change in the administration, and the Biden administration had been sabotaging it ever since they put it on the table on May 26th. Now, May 26th was a key date in 2024 because it was just days after the International Court of Justice issued its decision, remarkable decision, declaring that Israel was engaged in a process of genocide in the Gaza Strip and ordering it not to invade Rafah. So the ceasefire was put there in many ways to blunt the impact of the ICJ decision. And then the Biden administration, and they've openly said this, Blinken has openly said this, began negotiating with Israel about how they would invade Rafah. So it was to kneecap the International Court of Justice that they first introduced the ceasefire. Then, behind the scenes, they knew exactly what horrors were taking place inside the Gaza Strip. And this is all now coming out through our mainstream media, through like the most mainstream and I would say pro-Democratic Party outlets in the country. ProPublica, I think, has done some of the best reporting on this because they're getting the sources from inside the State Department. A lot of them are anonymous sources. They're generally not going to come talk to the Grayzone. Brett Murphy is the reporter from ProPublica. This is a thread of him summarizing his latest report on what took place inside Blinken's State Department. It came out on January 15th. It's worth reading in full. This is the human rights atrocity of our time. One senior official at State told me, I work for the department that's responsible for this policy. I signed up for this. I don't deserve sympathy for it. In November, Murphy says State Department human rights leaders met with one of Blinken's top lieutenants and begged the administration to follow through on a threat to cut off arms to Israel for blocking humanitarian assistance. And what happened? They're basically told to go screw themselves. All year, senior leaders repeatedly disregarded their own experts behind the scenes. They cracked down on leaks. This is incredible. By threatening criminal investigations and classifying material that was critical of Israel. So basically making it impossible for the public to see State Department expert analysis showing that Israel was using US weapons to carry out hideous atrocities. Some of the agency's highest-ranking Middle East diplomats complained in private that they were sidelined by Biden's National Security Council. That would be Brett McGurk and Jake Sullivan, who basically took over the policy. Here's State's top Palestinian affairs official on why he's been largely absent from the public eye. And he's just basically saying that the NSC told them to all shut up. And another point, leadership passed out NSC's list of banned words to government employees. They were not allowed to use words like Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. There are 350,000 Palestinians living under occupation in Jerusalem. And they had to instead use non-Israeli residents of Jerusalem. They were given total deference to Israel was given on the killing of an American citizen, Shireen Abu Akleh, the most famous reporter for Al Jazeera, who was killed by an Israeli sniper in Nablus, as well as kids who said they were abused in the Russian compound in Jerusalem, including like a 12-year-old girl. These were suppressed by the State Department.
Where Jeremy Lafredo, I believe, was detained, right? Our colleague at the Grayzone, when he was abducted by the Israeli military, I believe that's where he was held.
Thank you for pointing that out. Jeremy was held and abused in the Russian compound in Jerusalem, which is an Israeli torture center in the middle of Jerusalem. And he said that he heard Palestinians being tortured in adjacent cells, just screaming. On and on and on. I mean, I think the thread goes on for quite a while. 60 Minutes also had a special. The timing of it was pretty interesting. I'll get into that in a second. But it's worth watching. Hala Rarit, who was actually on the comms team of Matt Miller, the communications team at the State Department. She is one of the whistleblowers who actually quit the State Department and came out with the full details of how Blinken and Biden's NSC were doing everything possible to cover up for Israel's crimes and prevent a ceasefire. This went out loud. Yeah, and Josh Paul also was one of the key whistleblowers who was dealing with arms policy for the State Department, also resigned because he saw what Israel was doing with the weapons, and he was featured in that report. That report was filmed 8 months ago, right as the ceasefire was put on the table. What happened? It sat there for 8 months and 60 Minutes waited to drop it until it would not matter, until a ceasefire was already about to be signed, so that the Biden administration wouldn't feel pressured and so that it wouldn't make Kamala look bad and hurt her with the Democratic Party base that was wildly in favor of a ceasefire. So that's another good example of how media is, how we basically are watching regime media when we watch corporate media. But they did come out with a report that validates everything we've been saying on this stream for the past year and a half or so. And these are brave people. Most other people in the State Department just stayed there and delivered anonymous complaints and anonymous testimony to reporters. They're going to try to stay in their jobs under the Trump administration too.
They could have made that report 2 weeks into October 7th because it was already clear then what Israel was going to do and what the Biden administration was going to do. And certainly everyone inside government knew exactly what was going on. On the issue of the Biden administration going out of their way to classify material related to Israel for obvious reasons, because it shows their criminality and complicity with Israel. Politically, for the Trump administration, if they're thinking just cynical political calculations, it would look great for them if they would declassify all this material, because it would show what barbarians their predecessors were. And it would underscore to everyone who didn't know already that the Biden administration was complicit in one of the worst crimes ever. And of course, Trump probably won't do that because they're on board with Israel. But it just speaks to how unfortunate it is that we have a two-party system that is in lockstep with Israel, and how the public is just kept unaware. So all this classified material about what our government did might not be known until long after we're all gone. It's usually how it goes, where 60, 70 years later, that's when the truth can finally be disclosed. But if the Trump administration was smart, even just politically speaking, they would declassify that. They'd say people have the right to know about what this government just did.
Yeah. And the JFK files.
Oh, yeah. Well, that actually might come if Trump is to be believed. But yeah.
Well, another reason why, we haven't really addressed why the Biden administration didn't want a ceasefire when they could have ended this. We now see that it could have all been ended with a phone call. And I actually interviewed a Hamas official I actually interviewed him on October 7th, 2024 in Istanbul. Osama Hamdan, who is involved in the negotiating process and is a spokesman for Hamas in Beirut. And he insisted that they had accepted the deal in May. They've been accepting this deal since May, but that Israel keeps changing, moving the goalposts, and the U.S. lets Israel do whatever it wants. Now, Biden and Kamala Harris after him were being harmed dramatically by their support for this genocide among their own base as Kamala fought for to become president. There's a new YouGov poll out today. I think it was sponsored by IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, showing that a plurality of Democratic voters said that, a majority of those who did not vote for Kamala, who are registered Democrats, said that Gaza was a major reason. So why would they overlook that? Why would they overlook U.S. law like the Leahy law? Why would they overlook the mass slaughter of children? Why would they not want to deliver all of the hostages and captives, including Hirsch, Goldberg, Pollan, the ones who are American dual citizens, to a ceremony on the White House lawn during the summer? at the height of the election campaign. This would have been great for Biden and Kamala Harris. Why didn't they want to do that? Why were they willing to sacrifice them and the tens of thousands of people who are slaughtered in the Gaza Strip? It could be 200,000 who were killed for all we know. We don't have a full tally because so many are still under the rubble. The reason is that they love this war. And if you watched Matt Miller's comments, I didn't actually grab them in our pre-production for this stream, but I was at the briefing yesterday, and Matthew Miller said basically that we needed to weaken Hamas, we needed to weaken Hezbollah, and we liked seeing Hamas. This is almost his exact words. We liked seeing Hamas's ally in Syria be wiped off the map. He actually said wiped off the map. So the reason that they were obstructing the ceasefire was that they liked what Israel was doing in the region, and they wanted Netanyahu to change the map of the region and to bludgeon through genocidal force all of the axes of resistance until they were destroyed completely, and the only thing left to take place would be their version of regional integration, which is a peace among the undemocratic and rich, a peace between Israel and the medieval Gulf monarchies. That's what they've always wanted. That's what the Abraham Accords was. And Netanyahu promised that he would do that at the UN and in Congress, and it started to happen. This is what they actually thought was happening in Lebanon when the Israelis began really attacking harshly in Lebanon and assassinating leadership there. And I mean, this is a tweet by me in October, on October 1st. Amazing how the Biden administration picking former Israeli tank pilot Amos Hochstein to avert a war in Lebanon wound up with Hochstein green lighting an Israeli war while Biden drooled and stared off at the waves in Rehoboth. So basically, the Biden administration escalated the war in Lebanon, and Israel was beginning to escalate in Syria already in late September, early October, which meant there could not be a ceasefire in Gaza because they liked what Netanyahu was doing, killing Nasrallah, destroying Hezbollah munitions. And Politico even said so. U.S. military officials quietly backed Israel's military push against Hezbollah. The timing was right for such a military shift, they concluded. Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk, this is from the National Security Council, told top Israeli officials in recent weeks that the U.S. agreed with Netanyahu's broad strategy to shift Israel's military focus to the north against Hezbollah in order to convince the group to engage in diplomatic talks to end the conflict. So they're basically saying that escalation will lead to de-escalation. This was their strategy. And in order to escalate, you have to sabotage the ceasefire at every possible turn. Through assassinations, the pager attack, they loved that. They loved the pager attack. They endorsed the assassination of Nasrallah. And the offensive by HTS, rebranded Al-Qaeda in Syria, was already being planned at this point, and the U.S. knew all about it, the one that would storm into Aleppo and take over Damascus by December. So everyone in Gaza had to be sacrificed, including the captives and hostages. Yeah. This is why, for a cynical, sadistic, and honestly satanic geopolitical strategy of changing the regional dynamics through the Israeli Air Force. And that's why they kept the bombs flowing.
And this goes back to the Bush administration, which marked Syria for regime change right after 9/11, according to General Wesley Clark. And Brett McGurk served in that administration, and especially after the 2006 war, when Israel failed to defeat Hezbollah, a major reason why Hezbollah held off was because of the weapons they received through Syria. And that's when the Bush administration ramped up its effort to overthrow the Syrian government. There's cables from that period released by WikiLeaks showing that U.S. Embassy in Damascus was talking about exploiting Syria's vulnerability to what it called Islamic extremism, which turned out to be groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that's when Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was talking about the birth pangs of a new Middle East. It's because they recognized that Hezbollah was able to defend its country against Israeli aggression via allies like Syria. That's why Syria had to be destroyed. So Brett McGurk and Jake Sullivan and Amos Hochstein, they're just continuing what the Bush administration started. Of course, it goes back way before then, but in terms of this being like a concerted, dedicated U.S. policy where they're going to put muscle behind it and a lot of money and work with their allies in the Gulf to see this come to effect. This was them trying to fulfill that vision. This was them seizing that moment to fulfill a vision that was, cast a long time ago.
Absolutely. And in between, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Syria, all the countries on the hit list.
Yeah, and then using the destruction of Libya to help with the goal in Syria, because the weapons that the Syrian insurgents were getting, especially at the start of the Syria war, were coming from where? They were coming from the looted stockpile of the government that the U.S. helped overthrow inside Libya.
Exactly. So none of this would have been possible with the ceasefire. If it had happened in May, none of that destruction in the region would have been possible. And for Netanyahu, regional war propped up his coalition and boosted his popularity, which had plummeted after October 7th. So it was good for him as well. Now, this is also something that Matt Miller, spokesman for Tony Blinken, said in his final briefing, which I think is true. A lot of what Matt Miller says is a lot more candid and honest than Tony Blinken. Or maybe it's just hard to pay attention to Blinken because he's so uncharismatic. But he said that on October 16th, with the killing of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who was killed without the Israeli military knowing that they had killed him. He was actually fighting in the field with his men while Netanyahu was cowering in a luxury bunker and having F-35s shadow his personal jet. Sinwar was killed fighting in the field, having not eaten for 3 days with his men. And Miller said this should have been the moment when there could have been a ceasefire. This is when we could have had the ceasefire. That's kind of when the Biden administration decided to move towards a ceasefire proposal. But at the same time, and as I said at the time, negotiating a ceasefire would be very difficult, if not impossible, when you've killed the one figure who has to approve it. And remember, Israel killed all the previous negotiators before Sinwar, who were negotiating from the outside. Salah Arori was killed in his office in Beirut. He wasn't a militant. He was just a Hamas official whose name was on all the negotiations in Doha. They just assassinated him. And then Ismail Haniyeh, in an attempt to provoke Iran, was killed in his hotel room in Tehran at the inauguration of Pezeshkian, the Iranian president. And so they killed all the negotiators while Biden and Blinken are blaming Hamas. How many negotiators did Hamas kill? They're blaming Hamas for obstructionism and rejectionism. And Miller and Blinken have acknowledged this. So it was harder to get a deal. So it took a while for them to get the ceasefire in order. It basically took until Donald Trump was poised to take office, which denied them the political win, the PR propaganda win that they had sought for getting the deal. And also, they had to get Netanyahu to stand down, and they weren't going to do it because they never applied pressure. It was Trump who applied the pressure. So that's why it took this long. It really is, if you look at this chronologically and analyze how they obstructed this deal and why they did it, it tells the story of incompetence and pure evil. And it's a story that needs to be told in even greater detail with more sources. Hopefully there'll be, books and documentaries about it. The same way that we remember the evil and incompetence of the Bush administration in Iraq. And you know what's so evil is that so many people would still be with us today. I mean, just let's just like take all the context away from October 7th and be stupid for a second and say, oh, Hamas started this war. Well, there still could have been a deal, and it could have been worked out by at the latest May. It could have been worked out right away, honestly. And you're muted.
The initial offer from Hamas immediately was, we'll release all the captives if you agree not to invade Gaza. That was conveyed back in October, according to a representative of the families, of the Israeli hostage families. And of course, Netanyahu refused to do that. So there was a deal even available immediately, but it was ignored by Israel with the backing of the U.S.
Exactly. The October 7th operation was structured to make a deal feasible and possible from the beginning. It was the only leverage that Hamas had after being designated as a terrorist organization and placed under siege. If only they had been treated as well as the Al-Qaeda administration that has taken Damascus by force is being currently treated. We wouldn't be in this position. But even if this had all happened, there still could have been a deal in May because it's the same exact one that was just accepted, the same exact one, and so many people would still be alive. And that's what's so evil about this. Even if we're going to look at it from a conservative, decontextualized, ahistorical perspective. And that's why I'm so outraged, and why I just feel nothing but anger today. I don't feel like I should satisfaction having confronted Blinken, because we should have never been in this place. It's just hard to fathom that level of evil and stupidity. But that's what we've come to expect.